welcome to Context for Kids. This is Gospel Studies episode 4. And today we're going to be talking about why Ruth is in Messiah's genealogy. Now this one's rated G. Anyone can watch this one. This one won't be a big deal. Yay! I'm so glad it's not fun teaching PG-13 stuff, but still, hope your parents will watch it with you. They need to keep an eye on me because sometimes I can be a bit wacky. Okay, so here we go. Why is Ruth in Messiah's genealogy? Well, you might say, well, who's Ruth? Well, let's find out who Ruth is. We find out about Ruth in the book of Ruth. Yeah, there are only 2 Bible books named after women, and Ruth and Esther. There we go. So, Houston, we have a problem. See, Ruth is something called a Moabite. And the Moabites, God's not really very happy with them. Why? Here, we have this in Deuteronomy 23, verses 3 through 6. No Ammonite or Moabite, that's Ruth, shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall never, ever, it doesn't say never, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam, son of Beor, from Petor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God was not willing to listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. You shall never seek their peace or their prosperity all your days. Yikes. Yeah, before the Israelites got to the border of the promised land, they had to pass through some people's territory, and they said, listen, anything that we eat we will pay for, any water we drink we will pay for, we're just going to go on the road. We're not going to go on your crop. We're not going to war with you, because God actually, in Deuteronomy chapter 2, he said, you do not mess with Moab, and you do not mess. You do not mess with these people because, you do not mess with Moab, and you do not mess with Ammon, because they are the descendants of Lot. And God had an understanding with Lot, and those were his children. And also God had an understanding with Esau, because of the regard that God had for Lot's uncle Abraham, and because of Esau's father Isaac. And so he took care of them. He gave them land. When God gives someone lands, you don't get to take it away. It's just theirs. It's theirs. So, here we've got this situation in Moab and Ammon. So Moab and Ammon were relatives. Far removed, but yeah, they were related peoples. And they refused to let the Israelites cross their land, but God says, you don't mess with them, though, even though they were gooberheads. So they went and picked on the Amorites instead. Killed them all. Yep. All right, so Ruth was a Moabitess, and now I'm going to tell you the story about Naomi, Orpah, and Ruth. This really is a story about women, okay? Now, there came a time of famine in the land of Israel, and so Naomi's husband and her 2 sons left Israel to go search for greener pastures, literally. And so they went to the land of Moab, next door. Now, while there, her sons, Kilion and, I think his name is Mahlon, I did not write them down. I know Kilion is right. They got them wives. Now, Mahlon's wife was named Orpah, and Kilion's wife's name was Ruth. Well, Naomi's husband dies, and then both of Naomi's son dies, and so we have these 3 widows living in the house. Now, widows were considered to be the most vulnerable people pretty much on earth, apart from orphans. I mean, it was the worst thing that could happen to a woman is she was a widow because there was no one to take care of her. You know, she was easily oppressed, and God made he set down some laws that you do not mess with widows and orphans, and yeah, you just don't. You do not do it. So here were these three widows, and so Naomi tells Orpah and Ruth, her daughters-in-law, who she obviously loved very deeply, go back to your father's homes and try to make a life for yourself, because I can't have any more children to give you as husbands. What she was saying is, I have nothing to offer you. My life's over. My husband is dead. I have no possessions. I'm poor. I can't support you. You can't support me because you're widows too. So go back to your father's homes. And both of them loved her so much. They said, no, we can't do that. Finally, she convinces Orpah to go back to her father. But Ruth refuses to go. Ruth is a story of such wonderful faithfulness and love. You know, Ruth didn't want to go back to live among her people, the Moabites, and Chemosh, their god. It was, terribly wicked people. Just not as bad as the Amorites. But she didn't want to go back into idolatry. She had lived as an Israelite with Naomi and her family. She couldn't go back. Orpah could. So she said, no, I will follow you wherever you go. And although Ruth was a Moabitess, let's look. What did she say? She finally just refused to leave her, and she said, wherever you go, I will go. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. See right there? We have something amazing happen. Okay? Ruth has denounced her Moabite citizenship. She is no longer a Moabite. She has denounced her gods. She is no longer a worshiper of Chemosh. Probably she hadn't been for quite a while. And she wants to completely become an Israelite, go back to the land of Israel with her mother-in-law, even though there's nothing waiting for her and there had been a famine. So she had to be worried. Things were good in Moab. She could go back to her father's house. She was young. She could get herself another husband, probably. Especially when you know she was beautiful, too. Anyway, that meant that Ruth was no longer a pagan. Okay, so let's go back to this. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. I'm going to show you something. This is really cool. So one, Ruth was no longer a Moabitess. You see, whatever genealogy we're born into, whatever nation we're born into, doesn't have to define us. Once we become one of God's people, that's all erased. We are one of God's people, and that's always been the case. That verse back there, that was talking about somebody who would marry an unrepentant Moabite or Ammonite who never renounced their allegiance, who never renounced their gods. Because if they had renounced their citizenship and they hadn't renounced their gods, they wouldn't be Moabites or Ammonites, they'd be Israelites, right? Right. Remember, we had the mixed multitude come out of Egypt. They even think that maybe most of the people who came out of Egypt weren't even Israelites. They were other slaves out of Egypt and just Egyptians who said, my gods are trashed. Evidently, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is the one true God. Let's do this. Let's go with the winner. Okay? But they're never called the mixed multitude after they enter the land of Israel. They're just called Israelites. We never see the mixed multitude mentioned again. So, God is no respecter of persons. We see that in Acts chapter 10, which we'll get to probably in a couple of years. It's going to take a while. All right, so what did Ruth say? Your people would be my people and your God my God. Ruth was giving up everything to stay with Naomi and to become joined to the people of Israel. Pretty awesome. Ruth was no longer pagan. Now, Naomi and Ruth were desperately poor. And so they went back to the land holdings that they had, that the family would have had. And they had no crops planted. Of course, there were no men. And so Ruth would go out daily gleaning in the fields. I'm just giving you extra stuff now because I've already explained why Ruth can be in the genealogy, but now I want to show you more about why she was so honored and why anyone would be proud to have a woman like Ruth as a grandma. Great grandma in the case of King David. Okay, so she was gleaning in the fields. What does gleaning in the fields mean? Do you know? Let's look at Leviticus 23:22. And when you reap the harvest of your land, because God gave everybody land. Everybody in Israel had land. You shall not reap, that means harvest, that means cut down, gather. You shall not reap your field right up to the edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. And when you hear him say, I am the Lord your God, that's his way of saying, no arguments. This is just how it's going to be. So she was gleaning in the field of a man named Boaz. Now, Boaz obeyed this law. And this law meant that imagine a field of grain, okay? Big field of grain. And imagine the outside, maybe this much or however much was left. All along the outside. And that when the harvesters were on the inside of the field, and they would cut the sheaves and they'd put them in their arms, anything that fell over, they couldn't pick up. That was for the poor. And so they would go to the next, and after a while, you've got a lot of litter all over the floor. You've got a lot of good grain there. Okay? Ruth was in the fields getting that. She was getting the stuff on the sides, and she was getting the stuff behind Boaz's harvesters. Now Boaz looked at her, and she was beautiful. And he said, well, who's this? And they said, wasn't that the daughter-in-law of Naomi? Naomi has come back, she's poor, and this is her daughter-in-law who is doing this for her. And everyone was so impressed that a daughter-in-law would leave her, just a daughter-in-law would leave her family and come to be poor with her mother-in-law when she could have been eating well in her father's house. And it immediately just tore at Boaz's heart, and he told them, he says, you tell her, he makes sure that she's following them, and he was saying, keep dropping stuff. Just go ahead and drop as much as you want if she's right behind you. And so she was able to gather so much that she came home, her mother-in-law was like, dude, this is like, wow, how did you get so much stuff? There must have been other poor people, gleaning in the fields. And Ruth told her the whole story. And she kept gathering until the end of the harvest. And then came the time of the threshing. Now, I told you about the threshing floor. Didn't I? No, I was telling my kids, never mind, I can't remember who I tell what to. Threshing floor, really cool. I want you to go on to Google Images one of these days and look at a threshing sledge. Now, we're going to do a bigger lesson about threshing sledges, so I'm not really going to actually cover that now, so never mind. It's going to be in a few months. Yeah, well, we're going to talk about the threshing floor, because I think that comes up in Matthew 3. But Boaz was on the threshing floor, and all these guys that are on the threshing floor, this is where the wheat that they've gathered in is beaten, and the stalks, the long stem that's on the wheat, and all the little, you ever picked up a weed that's dried? You got you get a seed, and it has like a film on the outside? That's the chaff. And so they would have the oxen kind of go over top of it, and they would run the threshing sledge over it, and the threshing sledge was big. It had blades, and And after a while, all you would have is you would have the actual wheat or barley kernels separated, and they would take these forks and up, and so anyway, I just told you and I said I wasn't going to. This is why we never get anything done in a reasonable amount of time. So anyway, they would, in general, they would just stay at the threshing floor because it was a community threshing floor. They'd all take their stuff, they'd do their stuff, they'd gather it, they would stay there till it was done, like last week or 2 weeks ago with Jude at the sheep shearing. Okay, they just stay there till it's done, and then they go home with their stuff. Well, Naomi could see that Boaz was besotted, totally in love with Ruth. And so she said, my daughter, put on your nicest clothes, put on some perfume, make yourself look nice, go over to the threshing floor in the middle of the night and do exactly what I tell you. And so she went over to the threshing floor, and Boaz was there sleeping. And Ruth uncovered his feet. Now, why did she uncover his feet? Well, last week we were talking about levirate marriage, so if you didn't watch that one, this isn't going to make as much sense to you. But in the ancient Near East, if a woman died a widow without children, she had the right to seek out a marriage among close kin. Okay? Now, in Israelite law, it was brothers, but there were no brothers. And so when she uncovered Boaz's feet, she was reminding him of the chalitza. That's the Hebrew term for levirate marriage. Because there was a ceremony that would happen where if a guy refused to do it, the woman would take off his shoe and spit in his face. I was like, dude. And so she uncovered his feet. I'm sure it was cold, and so he woke up, saw that she had uncovered his feet. She knew exactly what he was he knew exactly what she was talking about. Really, she was in a way proposing marriage to him. This is what Naomi had told her to do because they were relatives. And he was just so overtaken, and he said, bless you for thinking of me and not one of the other younger men. He said, and he pretty much let her know that, yeah, he really would like to marry her, but there was a relative closer to her that he had to consult about it first. So, long story short, the other guy realizes that if he takes Ruth as his levirate wife, it's going to affect the inheritance of his property, because there's also property that would come to. It's a confusing story. But he said, no, we're not going to do this. And so Boaz was the next closest relative, and so he was allowed to marry Ruth, and the son she gave birth to's name was Obed, who was the father of Jesse, who's the father of David. Of course, David's the king, and that's a really, really big theme in the Bible. It's called the Kinsman Redeemer. You see, Boaz redeemed Ruth, redeemed the land that belonged to Naomi's family that she had to sell, so that they could afford to live. Of course, they only sold it for 50 years. But that's a long time. Imagine if you sold your land for 50 years, you wouldn't get it back, but your children would. But you'd be, after the money ran out, you wouldn't have any way to support yourself. So Boaz purchased back the land, married Ruth, and there's another incredibly honorable woman in Messiah's bloodline that people would have been glad to claim for their own, because again, those who make teshuvah, who were born in wickedness or led a life of wickedness. Remember, I taught you last week that in Judaism, it is believed that somebody who turns from wickedness and comes to God later in life has a place before God that even the righteous from birth do not have. That's just an amazing thing. And so Ruth was another one of those women. So why is Ruth in the genealogy of Messiah? Ruth shows us that it doesn't matter where we come from once we choose God as our king. I wanted to show you another little thing. Ruth undid the curse that was upon her as being a Moabite. Why? Because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt. What did Ruth do for her mother-in-law? Ruth went out in the fields every day and gathered food so that her mother-in-law wouldn't starve. See, Ruth not only wasn't a Moabite, but she was like the opposite of a Moabite. The Moabites denied the Israelites food and water. Ruth left a comfortable living, what would have been a comfortable living, and she worked slaving in the fields. Well, I mean, not as a slave, so that her mother-in-law could eat. So, pretty awesome, right? I love that. Oh, let's see now. Next week is David and Bathsheba, and that's going to be PG-13 because Bathsheba isn't mentioned by name. She's called the wife of Uriah, but again, that is to honor her, and we will see why next week. Okay, now our practical discipleship. Don't laugh. Okay, we've got the dog poop blues. When we have neighbors, when we're going to be a good neighbor, we have to look at everything we do. And one of the things that, just talking to different adults that drives people nuts is especially when people don't have dogs of their own, when people walk their dogs, let them poop in their yard, and they don't clean up after them. Imagine how you would feel if you didn't have any dogs, and one of the reasons you didn't have any dogs is because you didn't want to clean up after the dogs, or even if you did have dogs, you didn't want to clean up after other people's dogs, and people are making you clean up after their pets. Okay? So this is a really simple thing you can do. Always make sure when you're walking your dog that you're cleaning up their mess. Because you never know when you're going to meet with this person and you're going to want to share about Yeshua and the Torah and all this stuff, and have them not even want to hear anything about it because they don't want to hear you talking about loving your neighbors when they're cleaning up your dog poop. Yeah, it just makes sense. Or listening to your dog bark for hours and hours every day. People don't love our pets the way we do. And so we got to make sure that because we're getting all the benefit of our pets, we also have to take all of the penalties of having our pets. So our pets shouldn't be anyone else's problem. And that just solves a lot of problems. We don't want bad blood between our neighbors because we never know when God is going to be able to use us to share His truth and His love with them. We don't want them thinking bad things about us or about Him when we do that. So, anyway, that's this week. And, yeah, I love you. I'm praying for you. And I pray you have a wonderful week studying the Scripture together as a family. Bye-bye.